Welcome to Chautauqua People. My name is John V. Our guest today, Dr. Ralph Walton, is a psychiatrist with solid upstate New York credentials, medical school at Syracuse, and internship and residency at the University of Rochester. Subsequently, his military service took him to Panama and Fort Bragg. He was chief resident at the University of Rochester's Medical Center in psychiatry, later served as department chairman at Northeastern Ohio Medical University. He was brought to Jamestown by Joe Gerasi and Stan Lundeen, subsequently practiced here for many years. What sort of cases did you see while practicing in Jamestown?
Ran the gamut, every type of psychiatric disorder you can imagine.
Really?
Yeah.
Some of them were such as?
Acutely psychotic people, schizophrenic people, people with bipolar disorder, people with catatonic states, severe major depression, substance abuse, everything really.
Really. Is there any situation in this area which seems to contribute to mental illness at an unusually high rate?
Well, I think that the loss of industry, the loss of the industrial base, the movement of the furniture factories to the Carolinas produced a lot of unemployment. Unemployment can lead to substance abuse and stress. Again, that doesn't cause the major mental illnesses. Schizophrenia, has a 1% prevalence worldwide. So the unemployment situation, although it can exacerbate an underlying problem, doesn't cause a problem like bipolar illness or schizophrenia. But I think there is a direct relationship to psychiatric problems like substance abuse.
Substance abuse in particular.
Yes.
Now, I understand that we're talking of substance abuse. You established a methadone maintenance program at the University of Rochester. How did
Yes.
that come about? And tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, I was a young assistant professor in the medical school. I ran one of the inpatient units in Wing R, which is the psychiatry division of Strong Memorial Hospital. And we did not serve these substance abuse patients. We had no alcohol or drug treatment program, and I thought that was highly inappropriate. So I went to the chairman and said that I thought that Strong Memorial Hospital, the University of Rochester Medical Center, really needed to address substance abuse. Strong Memorial viewed itself as a very pristine place. They didn't particularly want heroin addicts in the lobby of Strong Memorial Hospital. But I lobbied that this was inappropriate, that we really needed to address a significant community problem. And my boss said, well, you want a substance abuse facility here? Make one. So I was given the charge of creating a drug treatment program.
So they did it in that existing campus? Then?
Yes, we did it in the existing campus.
Elmwood
Yes.
Avenue, carved out some space.
Yes. Yes.
Did you get a lot of blowback from that?
Oh, tremendous. I mean, a lot of the older faculty, my colleagues in the Department of Psychiatry, were really angry with me because suddenly they had prostitutes in the lobby of Wing R. Many of the heroin addicts had to support their habit by unseemly professions.
Mm-hmm.
So we had folks who never had been in the lobby of Strong Memorial Hospital before. And many of my colleagues were very upset with me. Yeah.
But indeed, does that program still persist?
Yes, it's still there. It's still there. There's still a methadone maintenance clinic at Strong.
That's quite understandable. Now, I understand, we're sort of skipping along here, that depression is regarded as a very common, serious problem.
Yes.
And tell me about what treatments you use to treat depression.
I really wish we had a different term, because depression has this common everyday usage. People say all the time, oh, I'm depressed, etc. But major depression is a very different animal from the sort of downturn in mood that all of us experience from time to time. And a downturn in mood because you, say, lost a job or lost a relationship, although one needs support at times like that, that's not the type of situation where you should jump in with an antidepressant. That should not be treated with chemicals, with medication. What needs to be treated with medication is major depression, which, as I said, is a very, very different entity from the depression that we all experience from time to time.
And so what were your treatments?
Well, the for a long time, the only available treatment was psychotherapy. Today, most general psychiatrists use combinations of psychotherapy and, when appropriate, medications. But again, in my own practice, I only use the medication to treat depression when it fulfilled the diagnostic criteria for what's called major depression.
Mm-hmm. And those criteria came from?
There's something called the DSM-5 now, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, which lists various signs and symptoms. And if you fulfill those diagnostic criteria, then I think a medication is appropriate. If you don't, it's not.
And what medications are typically used now?
Typically now we use medications called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which will increase the availability of a very important neurotransmitter in the brain, serotonin. Again, we have some idea about what's going on chemically, but we don't have a definitive answer as to what causes major depression. We believe that serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, these are various neurotransmitters, various chemical messengers in the brain, that they are involved. And when we manipulate that level through the use of medications, we can often treat a major depression. Again, these medications are not totally ideal. They often have some side effects, but it's better than just psychotherapy alone. Mm-hmm. But I think we need to combine the judicious use of medication and psychotherapy.
And that's requires dedication, does it not?
Yes.
Now, would you as a psychiatrist do most of the talk therapy, or would you have?
You know, I used to. When I started my career, I often saw patients for the classic 50-minute hour. Towards the end of my years in practice, no. I mean, insurances don't reimburse psychiatrists for that. They want people who are a little less expensive to do the 50-minute psychotherapy. And unfortunately, psychiatrists are often relegated today to the role of medication management. That's unfortunate, in my opinion,
right,
but that's what's happening.
That's the world we live in.
Yes.
Now, we talked a little bit, what were the options when medication is unsuccessful? And you understand the medication is a bit of a matter of trial and error.
Yes, it is a matter of trial and error.
You make your best call, and those medications don't work out. What's next?
Well, for treatment-resistant depression that is severe, for example, if a person is a risk to themselves, if they're seriously thinking of suicide, and either the older antidepressants, the so-called tricyclics, or what are called monoamine oxidase inhibitors, don't work, and the modern ones don't work, the SSRIs, if nothing seems to work, we do have a treatment that works, and some of the viewers may be shocked to learn
bad
that...
pun.
Yeah, bad pun, sorry about that, John. But may be shocked that ECT, shock treatment, is still an extremely successful therapy, if done properly.
Let's talk more about what is properly.
You know, if you see a movie like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you're going to be dismayed that this is a horrible sort of treatment, the way it's portrayed in movies. By properly, what I mean is that it's done with modern equipment which delivers a very brief pulse and induces a seizure that we monitor. When I did ECT, I tried to restrict the length of that seizure to about 20 seconds, but I needed close to that in order for the treatment to be effective. And I did it 3 times a week for a couple of weeks. In other words, a total usually of about 6 treatments, sometimes up to 12. But in my practice, I never went above 12 because then you could get some memory loss if you pushed it too far. And we didn't need that. Most often, a patient that I treated with ECT would be dramatically improved after 4 or 5. I would go to 6 because if you stop before 6, the recurrence rate is fairly high. So I would typically go to 6, sometimes 7 or 8. And as I said, would monitor the seizure. The seizure was observable only on EEG. We gave muscle relaxants so that you could not actually see a seizure. We could only see it on the monitor. So we knew that there was a seizure going on in the brain, and that's what we want. But you couldn't see it peripherally. You couldn't see what looked like an epileptic seizure. In the old days, before muscle relaxants, yes, you could see the patient actually convulsing. Today, they don't actually convulse. We paralyze the muscles. And they're under general anesthesia, so they're not aware of all of this.
Any other medications besides the muscle relaxants? If they're under general anesthesia, that's be a second medication, wouldn't it?
Yes, yes.
And you have a anesthesiologist?
Yes, I always worked with an anesthesiologist, yes.
So indeed, that had a high level of effectiveness.
Yes.
Now, how did your patients respond afterward?
The patients who had ECT were the most grateful patients that I took care of. I really loved it when I had a situation where I could do this treatment, which was so highly and quickly effective. You know, if you use a medication successfully, that might take 6 to 8 weeks before it works properly. ECT works within days. And as I said, patients went from profoundly depressed states to feeling fine within days. So you have very, very grateful patients. I'm just sad that it has such a terrible reputation that it's often difficult to convince patients that this would be effective, that this would be useful.
And yet there is a research base, as I understand it, to demonstrate the efficacy.
Oh yes. Every study, it's been studied so much, and every study has concluded, every legitimate study has concluded that this is one of the most effective treatment modalities actually in all of medicine.
Really?
Yeah.
Really. Now, a great deal of research on treatment on major depression was conducted in previous decades using hallucinogenic drugs.
Yes.
And that had a sudden stop. What caused it?
I'm not sure what caused the sudden stop. I mean, people were using it recreationally, and there was a societal bias against the use of these sorts of hallucinogenic agents therapeutically. You know, people like Timothy Leary and others at Harvard looked at this, but there was a negative societal view of the use of hallucinogens therapeutically. But that's changing now a little bit because we do have some current research that indicates, as you and I were talking about this morning, that a drug like ketamine, which is a dissociative anesthetic, seems to have a very powerful therapeutic effect for major depression.
Now, how is ketamine administered?
It's administered intravenously, except there's a form of it, S-ketamine, which can be given as a nasal spray. But again, this is not FDA approved at this point in time.
So
right now we're talking about research.
So it's an off-label use?
It's an off-label use. Yeah, there are physicians who will use it, but they probably shouldn't yet. I mean, we don't know enough about the long-term effects, about the potential side effects. We don't know proper dosing, so it's premature to jump in. I mean, there are people who do benefit greatly from it who are involved in research studies and so forth, but we're still really in the research phase on this.
I read some articles in preparation for a discussion about places that have ketamine clinics.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, you're saying that
That's premature.
It's precisely.
Yeah.
And indeed, let there be the research base and come from it with that. Now, Ralph, you are best known for your work on aspartame.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could tell me how that came to your attention.
Actually, it came to my attention through a fellow Chautauquan. When I was teaching at the University of Rochester, my boss, a world-renowned psychiatrist, Lyman Wynn, had a cousin by marriage who had problems with major depression, which was treatment-resistant. She was seeing actually a psychoanalyst, and she was a Chautauquan. She resided in Chautauqua and came from Chautauqua to Rochester to see me. And she fulfilled all the diagnostic criteria. Back then it wasn't DSM-5, we were in DSM-2, that was a long time ago. And I put her on an old so-called tricyclic antidepressant, a medication by the name of imipramine. Trade name was Tofranil. And it was dramatically effective for her. Within 3 or 4 weeks, she was fine. And so I would see her then about every 6 months or so, just to check on her, renew her medication, because we discovered that whenever she went off it, her depression would come back. But as long as she maintained 150 milligrams a day of imipramine, she was just fine. And when I was recruited to this area, then I continued to see her. As I said, she was a Chautauquan, so she didn't have to drive to Rochester anymore to see me, so I continued to see her. Until one day I got a call from Dr. Robert Weddingfeld, who was her internist, and he was chief of medicine at the old Jamestown General Hospital. And she was hospitalized there under his care because she had a sudden grand mal seizure. This is a woman who was not epileptic. She had not had a stroke. She'd not had brain trauma. It was a mystery. Why? She was then 54 years of age. Why this 54-year-old woman had a sudden onset of a grand mal seizure. And Bob said, please come in and see her, because aside from the seizure, something else is going on with Mary. She is very, very different. He said, I've never seen her like this. She's not the Mary that I knew. And I went into the hospital to see her. And indeed, she was hypomanic. She was talking a mile a minute. She was grandiose. She was euphoric. She was having a hypomanic episode. I'd never seen this before in her. Now, bipolar disorder certainly could have its onset, but it would be very unusual for a 54-year-old woman to have the onset of bipolar illness at that point in life. Usually it manifests itself much before then. It was possible, but I didn't think it was likely. So I did some detective work with her. What was different in her life that might have contributed to a seizure and now a hypomanic episode? She wasn't full-blown manic, but almost. And she said that she was a little bit overweight, and she always drank a lot of iced tea during the summer, which she had sweetened always with a lot of sugar. Because of her concerns over her weight, she decided to switch from sugar to this new product that was on the market, something called Crystal Light, which was aspartame. So she went from sugar to massive amounts of Crystal Light. I didn't know much about aspartame at that point, but I did some reading and some research and learned that Richard Wertman, who was the chief of brain sciences at MIT, had written multiple papers on the neurochemical effects of aspartame. He was a real opponent to the use of aspartame. And he had written that this so-called methyl ester of a dipeptide, it was 2 amino acids and the methyl ester of those amino acids, that could change the levels of what are called catecholamines and indolamines. I don't want to get into all of that now, but basically the bottom line was that I felt that with these neurochemical changes that could lower the seizure threshold and increase the likelihood of a manic event. So I wrote a paper about that. It was it was a case episode. It wasn't a double-blind study. Today, case reports are denigrated in medicine. But throughout most of medical history, progress was made through case reports, through physicians looking carefully at what happened to individual patients. So I still am a firm believer in the value of individual case reports. But surprisingly, it did get published, even though it was a single case report. It got published in one of the major journals. And after it was published, I received a call from the man I mentioned a moment ago, Richard Wertman, the chief of brain sciences at MIT. And he asked me if I had any other patients like this. I said, no, I didn't. But it so happened that I was president of the medical society, the local medical society at the time. So at our medical meetings, I asked my fellow physicians to be on the lookout for unusual seizures. And if they had a patient who had a seizure that they couldn't explain, I'd like them to refer them to me, because I was interested in pursuing whether aspartame could be involved in other seizures. And when I had a collection of patients where I felt that to be the case, I got back in touch with Richard Wertman, and he said that he was organizing a conference in Washington, an MIT conference in Washington, D.C., entitled Dietary Phenylalanine and Brain Function. And would I be willing to present a paper at that conference? And I said I'd be happy to do so, and did just that. And then I wrote a chapter in a book that he published with that same title, Dietary Phenylalanine and Brain Function. I wrote the chapter on seizures. So that's how I began to get into it. I then, since, as I said, case reports are denigrated really in medicine, they're not respected, I decided I better do a double-blind study. And I did just that.
What's a double-blind study?
Oh, a double-blind study is a situation where you give somebody either a medication or some active component, in this case aspartame, and you also give them a placebo. And as an investigator, you don't know which group is which. You're blind as to who's getting placebo and who's getting the active component, hence double-blind.
Mm-hmm.
So we did that where I took 40 volunteers, and half of them were given a placebo, half of them were given aspartame. By the way, I had a tough time getting aspartame. The NutraSweet company claimed that they would give aspartame to any legitimate researcher for research. So I applied to them. I said, I'm doing a double-blind study. I'd like the aspartame capsules. And they refused to give it to me. They said it wasn't needed research, and even though they said that any legitimate researcher would be given these aspartame capsules. At that point, I was chairman of a medical school department, so I think that should have qualified me as legitimate, but they wouldn't give it to me. And they actively blocked my attempts to buy it from local bottlers. I figured I could go to the local Pepsi folks because they were using aspartame, or local Coke folks, and I made multiple calls, and they wouldn't sell it to me. They'd been told by the company not to sell it to me. I found we had to do a worldwide search because you can't just go and get Crystal Light or over-the-counter things. You have to have so-called USP grade aspartame for legitimate research, and that's tough to get. But we finally did a worldwide search, and we bought some from Europe. We got some. But, I'm glad actually that I didn't use what NutraSweet would have sent me. Who knows what they would have sent me? So I'm glad that we bought it elsewhere.
Now, what did you find out from your research?
We actually had, what I found out was that that the adverse effects were so severe that our IRB, that is the Institutional Review Board, actually put a stop to the study.
This was the medical school IRB.
Yes, the medical school IRB put a stop to the study because of the severity of the adverse effects. I figured that's the end of our study, you know. But our statistician looked at it carefully, and even though we'd stopped it prematurely, and we had a small n as a result, the statistics were such that we had a statistically significant result. There was a huge difference that was statistically significant, despite the small n, between those who got active aspartame and those who got placebo. All of these severe reactions were in the aspartame group, in the aspartame arm of the study.
And so
that was published. So our study was published, and since my name was on many of these studies, then I got the call from Mike Wallace, 60 Minutes, did the story on it, and hence my career as an aspartame researcher.
And so you did the study, and tell me about your time with Mike Wallace.
Oh, actually, I worked with the 60 Minutes folks for over a year. They had some internal squabbles. Don Hewitt, who was the producer, one of the two producers of 60 Minutes, did not want to do the story on aspartame. He felt that they'd been sued recently by the tobacco industry, and he had been really stung by that lawsuit. So he argued a lot with Mike Wallace, saying that should not do this story. Mike very much wanted to do the story, and I was sort of in the middle. Don Hewitt swore at me. He was a difficult man, Don Hewitt. And Mike Wallace was delightful. Before I got interviewed, I was terrified of the interview, though. I figured he was going to rake me over the coals and do the typical rough, difficult Mike Wallace interview. But he was fine. It was a pleasant experience.
And so you shared the results of your study on camera with
Yes.
Mike Wallace.
And they actually showed one of the charts that's in this book demonstrating that virtually, well, not virtually, that 100% of the industry-funded studies concluded that it was perfectly safe. And 100% of the independently funded studies identified one or more problems. So there's a total correlation. Who paid for the study?
That's remarkable, isn't it? And now, you also testified in Europe.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, I got a call from a young lady one day with a strong British accent who said she was the administrative assistant for Roger Williams, who was a member of Parliament. And Roger Williams was convinced that aspartame was highly toxic, and he wanted to introduce legislation in the House of Commons banning aspartame in the United Kingdom. And they wondered if I would be willing to come to England to work with him on the legislation and to testify before the House of Commons. She then put Roger Williams on the phone. He told me that they really would love to have me come, but they couldn't pay for it. They couldn't fund me. I'd have to pay my own way. But would I still be willing to come and to testify? And I told him I would. I consulted with Mary, my wife, and she'd never been to England. So we decided that we would do this. And Roger Williams got into this issue actually because of somebody he was a member of Parliament from Wales, and one of his constituents was a high school science teacher. And she had a 10-year-old son who had a sudden grand mal seizure. And the family doctor wanted to put the boy on anticonvulsants. She wasn't convinced that her son was epileptic, and as a science teacher, she did her own sort of investigation and experimentation. She tried to figure out what was different in her son's life, and what was different was that he too, like my patient, was a little too heavy, and he suddenly switched to all diet drinks. He'd been using regular pop, and he suddenly switched to diet drinks. So she wondered whether the aspartame in his diet drinks might have been responsible for his seizure. And being a science teacher, she did her own little experiment. She, first of all, took him off all diet products, made sure that he had no aspartame in his diet whatsoever, didn't have any more seizures. Then she decided she would reintroduce aspartame into his diet. She gave him some diet colas, and he had another seizure. So she knew. I mean, imagine a mother she didn't know that there would be a seizure, but he did have a second seizure as soon as she gave him a diet drink.
Great case study.
Yes. Again, an individual, not a double-blind study, but an individual case study. And she was convinced, and she got in touch with her member of Parliament, Roger Williams. He had, as a matter of fact, he was a very well-educated man himself. He had a PhD from Cambridge in physiology. So he was a very scientifically oriented man. He did his own research, and he came to the conclusion, this is very toxic stuff. We've got to outlaw it in the United Kingdom. And so he and I worked for a week together. It was a great week because, as I said, he couldn't pay for my trip, so he felt obligated to give me and Mary a great time, and he showed us parts of Parliament that no tourist ever sees. So it was wonderful. And every afternoon, we'd work on the legislation in the morning, on the wording of the legislation. He and I wrote that out. And in the afternoons, he took me to the House of Lords, and we would have a glass of wine in the House of Lords every afternoon.
What became of his legislation?
It's in the book, too. I knew that it was going to be defeated because I saw the same lobbyists. When I was in Washington for the conference on dietary phenylalanine, I was approached actually by some industry lobbyists who wanted to take me and Mary to dinner. I refused. But I also had met before, and the day before my presentation, I'd met with a group of researchers from Temple University who were going to present a paper on aspartame complicating the control of diabetes. And I saw those researchers whom I had spoken with having dinner with the same lobbyists who'd approached me. My wife and I went to dinner in the same hotel restaurant, and we were by ourselves, but I saw those lobbyists who had offered to take me to dinner with the Temple University researchers, and the next day their paper was pulled, was not presented.
What a point. What a point. So let's advance this. What is the current European standard about aspartame?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I was invited to testify before EFSA. EFSA is the European Food Safety Authority.
Mm-hmm.
And that EFSA is located in Parma, and they're the FDA for Europe, for the European Union. When I was there, when I was sitting waiting to give my testimony, I saw the same researchers who had industry-funded research, so I knew what the outcome was going to be. And I subsequently, it's in the book too, that I learned, I did my own detective work on this, I learned that a lot of the people on the EFSA committee had some grants from industry, from the sweetener industry. So I knew what the result was going to be. Despite my testimony.
Yeah, and the American standard is essentially unchanged.
Yeah, the American standard is there's all this research that shows that it's safe, all of it funded by the industry.
Goodness. Now, a couple of questions we talked about, and we're out of time, but the staff always indulges me. This goes so quickly. If a young Chautauquan comes to you, expresses an interest in a career in psychiatry, looking for advice, what would be your counsel?
My counsel would be to certainly take science courses. They're going to have to go to medical school, but to also take some really good literature courses that as a psychiatrist you have to be able to interact with all sorts of people. You need to be able to listen to people, to understand their stories, and literature would be a good way to do that. So I would encourage them not to be too narrow. That yes, they need the chemistry, the biology, the mathematics, but they also need a more well-rounded education. And I would encourage them to take some good English courses.
So try some humanities,
yes,
essentially.
it's humanities, yes.
Humanities. Is there anything else we need to cover? I mean, we've just remarkable. I could go on endlessly here.
No, I don't think so, John.
I would just end as one thing. Let me see, hold up the book here. Now, when we talked this morning at the end, Dr. Walton said, would you like a copy of the book? And I said yes. And as one who's regarded as a full professor of psychology, I greatly enjoyed reading bits of this in preparation for our discussion. And I would urge any Chautauquan looking at this to take a trip to the Chautauqua bookstore. And this is not at Dr. Walton's behest, but at my initiative. Take a good look at this book, and if you buy it, I think you will be richly rewarded with the read. This has been fun.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. It has been fun.
And I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the book. Thank you.